But as a Halloween fan, especially someone who has worked on the Halloween series, and you basically witnessed at least three reboots. You had Halloween H2O and Halloween Resurrection, essentially following the story out of Laurie Strode. Then you had Rob Zombie's Halloween and Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, and then finally you have Halloween, Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends, essentially following another story of Laurie Strode falling directly after the first Halloween and just
Hmm.
ignoring essentially all the others. As a
Yeah.
fan and person who worked on the movies, like, did you did you imagine, okay, like this is the type of stuff that I would love to see everywhere else, or was like in terms of being both a fan, like what were your thoughts? But also, but as a person who worked on the film, I mean, on the films, or at least on Halloween, what were your thoughts as a screenwriter for those films? There we go. And not a question, because essentially, what I'm trying to ask is, as a fan, like, what did you enjoy about these three reboots? And as a person who has worked on the Halloween series and screenwriter, like, what did you think as like on like the production, like storyline wise there.
I mean, listen, I know how hard it is to write one of these. The original movie was a success because it was unique and it was original, and anything that anybody does is going to be compared to that. So that's not an easy task. So I always, applaud any filmmaker who can, I don't know, try to step into those shoes and do a pretty good job of it. I mean, like any fan, I mean, I probably have favorites and least favorites of all of that. I'm not going to, demean anybody's or impugn anybody's work. Um, I wasn't particularly a fan of the Rob Zombie incarnation. I just felt like it was kind of like a different franchise in a sense, starting off in a different way. It's just a different sensibility than I felt like what the original movies were about. Doesn't make it any less valid. I think that those movies have their fans. Just like Halloween 3 has its fans, and Halloween 6 has its fans. I'm just never one to kind of say what's good and what's bad. I mean, for me, I thought H2O was clever, but I felt like it also kind of suffered a little bit from screamitis. I
Yeah.
used a lot of its soundtrack, and I think its wink wink to the audience was maybe for me a little too broad. It became a little comical in a sense. But that was the time. It wasn't. It was. Yeah, I mean, Dimension. Miramax had made Scream. It was a big success. They brought Kevin Williamson in to do some work on the script for Halloween H2O. So it had that fingerprint on it. It made sense. Resurrection, I felt like, well, they tried something different. I don't think that was that successful. And then they did the Rob Zombies, and now obviously that is super success with this last one. And I think probably the next one will be very successful. I think in a way, like, what for me, what I can only talk about my experience was the fact that we had Donald Pleasance on set
Yeah.
was made it really special. It was the last movie he did in the franchise. The fact that I got to meet with him and I got the experience of him saying my words, that I was a 24-year-old writer at the time who had his dream fulfilled by having this opportunity. So to me, it was all just a gift, and it's started a career that now has lasted over 25 years. So I have nothing but fond memories of all of it, and
Yeah.
despite the frustrating aspects of it and things that I would have loved to have done differently, had I had more say in the matter. But listen, it was truly a gift that changed my life. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, and I do agree, because there's always that one project of yours in your past that will always be a grateful experience to you, because not only did you learn a lot of lessons, you essentially got I want to say, like, great input, just great moments on a set. Um, it's like the same thing with theater, where it's like I've worked with so many theater productions that I can't really name one, because all the theater productions I've worked on have been a great fun of mine. It has been great fun, but there's always got to be that one theater production that would always stick to my mind, both professionally and just on a more fun level. So I would definitely agree with you that Halloween 6 does feel like that on a professional level, it was a interesting thing, but as a like on a more uh yeah, with Halloween 6, I want to like with Halloween 6, it does sound like on a professional level, it was an interesting time, but on a more um, experience level, it was much more. Uh, it had a very fond. You have a very fondness in it. There we go. It had
Yeah,
a
no, I do.
big
I have
fondness.
great fondness. I mean, it was, we're all young. We're all just starting out. We're all kids. Running around making a movie with this kind of great lineage attached to it. And knowing that John Carpenter themes were going to be attached to this film, and I was going to meet Alan Howarth, who had scored all of the sequels, and that I got to work with Marianne Hagan, who was just, I thought, wonderful, and became a good friend, and obviously Paul Rudd, who's a superstar now. It's
Yeah,
just, we're all just starting out, and it was just a, a I look at it as like a time capsule of my life, and I'm just eternally grateful.
great. Now, following Halloween 6, where did you go in terms of your screenwriting? Because I know we were just talking about this before, is that uh, I'm not sure if it was your next credit, but a few films after that, you produced The Haunting in Connecticut.
Mhm. Yep.
I remember actually seeing trailers for that, and this was coming up at a time where like ghost stories sort of were starting to come on and come back. It wasn't
Mhm.
before Paranormal Activity, where it kind of like springboarded everything back to not where it was like, oh, it was found footage, all that, it was
Mhm.
found footage and stuff like that too. It was like the mid '90s, not the mid '90s. Oh my god, the mid 2000s. There was like a springboard of paranormal movies that were coming out at the same time. You had the Amityville Horror by Platinum Dunes. You had Haunting in Connecticut. You had The Ring. Uh, The Grudge. Basically, yeah, things that were essentially springboard, like the paranormal movies that were coming out in the 2000s, especially in early to mid 2000s, were changing the way the horror was perceived because it was now more it was like less R-rated movies and more geared towards PG. Well, I wouldn't say PG-13 crowds, but at least geared towards PG-13s and making the scares more like actual scared, like actual like focus on the scares rather than the gore. How did you come up to getting? How did you actually produce The Haunting of the Canada in a very
I
unique?
um I well, it goes back to a while before that. I had dipped my toe into the documentary pool of filmmaking, and I had actually, year 2000, I had written, directed, produced a 2-hour documentary that ended up on the History Channel on the Amityville horror
Yeah.
story, and it aired on Halloween night, so that was kind of perfect. And it was kind of the beginning of my interest in that side of horror. So anyway, there was another documentary that aired called A Haunting in Connecticut, and I had remembered after watching it and thinking it was a great documentary, it was Discovery Channel, that I had read a book, I want to say way back in high school, called In a Dark Place. It was about the same story, and it was a book that was so riveting and terrifying. I remember sleeping with the lights on. I was a pretty scared kid. So anyway, so yeah, I remembered it, and I thought, God, how interesting this would be, to make a movie out of this. We had, because of the documentary, I had developed a long friendship and business relationship with George Lutz, who had lived in the Amityville house and had
Oh wow.
controlled the rights to the sequels for Amityville. So during those years, we were trying to get something off the ground, but then this other documentary came across my plate, I should say, I would say, and it was interesting. I thought it was relatable because of the concept of this young boy with cancer, and his mother's trying to save him, and sort of out of desperation she rents this house just to be closer to the hospital because he was so sick. Um, so just, I thought that story was something a lot of people would relate to. So I did some detective work, which I've become very good at, tracking people down, and which later came into play when I did a Nightmare on Elm Street documentary. But yeah, so I was able to find the family that the story, The Haunting in Connecticut, was based on. Their true story, at least was true to them. Um, and I convinced them that, hey, we should work together and try to make a movie out of this, and they thought it was a good idea. And so with my management company at the time, a guy named Andy Trapani really took the lead, and we ran around with it for a little while and ended up getting a company called Gold Circle interested, and they developed a script with some different writers. I was working on something else at the time, so I wasn't able to write the draft, the first draft.
Hmm.
I'd written a treatment for it at one point. And it just kind of started to come together. It took a while, it was probably about a year or two in development. And then Lionsgate got interested in it. And off we went to Canada and made the movie there in Winnipeg. And it came out, and it was just out of the blue. I mean, I talk about a test screening. We tested that movie, and I was there, and it was through like the roof. It was through the roof. The numbers were fantastic. It was somewhere in the 80s or maybe even low 90s. So they
Wow.
knew that they had sort of a little hit on their hands. So right then and there was decided we'd get a big theatrical release, and it came out, and I think it was like the #2 movie that weekend, and it brought in like $25 million and ended up making a lot more. So yeah, and it was a really cool, gratifying project to be a part of.
Yeah, because it's like, as I said, it's like I remember the trailers of Hunting in Connecticut, but it's like I rarely remember a lot outside of the poster, which was
Yeah,
essentially
the ectoplasm and the coming out of the kid's mouth.
yeah, and I'm like, sometimes when you're looking at a poster, it's a good way to
Mhm.
sell a movie, because sometimes you can have. And the weird thing is, like, nowadays, if you look at a poster for sorry, if you're looking at a poster for uh, say, like a Marvel movie or DC movie, which I'm not knocking against them. It's like it's very overcrowded with a lot of characters. But if you're looking at a store at a horror poster, you sometimes just need like maybe one character or just one location that would really, or maybe even one set piece that would be like the notion of what you could
Mhm.
expect from this. I remember seeing the poster for Poker Guys, the remake, and it was just basically Poker Guys, and it was just a clown, and you kind of like, oh, the clown is going to be the forefront of this thing. It's like, one, if you ever seen the original Poker Guys, you know what the clown is about, and then it's like sometimes when you're doing a poster work for marketing, you always have to have something that's like very, very marketable about it. And and seeing the kid and whatever's like coming out of his mouth is like a very, very strong image to see, because
Mhm.
one, you don't know what to expect, because it's like it's a haunting in Connecticut, and you just see this kid looking in pain, and then you just see whatever is coming out of his mouth. Just going, oh my God, one, you're kind of like like, one, you want to see what's like what got to that point, but also it gets more people to actually go see a film, because
Well, that's
it's
the whole idea of marketing, is to hook the audience into wanting to see your product. So, but yeah, I give Lionsgate full credit for that poster. It was one of the very first, I guess, lenticular motion posters. So if you went to a mall and you saw that
yeah.
poster, it would actually move. That ectoplasm would erupt from his mouth, and it would be like animated. So it was really inventive, and it definitely drew audiences to theaters. Um, we were certainly, pre-Conjuring and the big wave of sort of supernatural movies that followed us. But yeah, it was successful, and yeah, it was a fun project to be a part of.
Now, you mentioned the name before, the Amityville, and you worked on two projects, well, three projects really. or is it 2 or 3?
No. Well,
Because you
if you
just mentioned.
count the documentary, I did a documentary, and then I did two. I produced one of the films, more recent films, and then I wrote and directed and produced one of the most recent films.
Okay. So yeah, so three, so three thing, so
Three.
three.
Three projects with the name Amityville with my name on them.
Yeah, one being a documentary, and
Yes,
two.
exactly.
So that's why I was trying to get more, because when you say projects and then it's like I don't want to like dismiss documentaries as not being like a film, because documentaries are film. It's just that when you say it's like when you mention film, it's like, are you talking about a regular film or a short film? So anyway, how going with Amityville, how did those two projects go hand in hand? Because I know, because it's weird, because Amityville: The Awakening, I actually did something similar to that. It's weird because a few years ago in my media class, for our final project, we had to essentially, in New York City, I mean, in New York State, our project was essentially go through and pick out like very famous landmarks, right? People went like pick vineyards, the vineyard, Statue of Liberty, but the majority of the class, oddly enough, picked the Amityville house. I'm like, why would that be a shock to us? And my job was essentially to with marketing, right? So I had to be the one that would market the thing. So it's weird, because to know that you actually was part. I mean, it's funny. Well, not funny. It's interesting to note that you were actually part of the Amityville Horror Awakening movie when I was actually doing the thing for this class, promoting a film that was essentially not released until more than a few years later. So it's, I mean, I could ask like, uh, I do want to ask like, your experience with that film, but going back to Amityville, you mentioned George Lutz and him holding the rights to like the more movies. Did you essentially go to him or the rights and say, "Hey, I have an idea for an Amityville movie," to, especially since it's been like say maybe 10 years after the remake had like came out, and
Well,
it's like, how did Awakening come to come into play? There we go.
okay. Well, it was long before the remake that I met him. The remake became the subject of a lot of litigation and a lot of problems, fortunately. It's a very long story. I won't get into the details of
Yeah,
all of it, but yeah. So it's, I had done the documentary, and George Lutz and I became kind of fast friends, and I respected him. I listened to his story. For those who claimed it was all a hoax and he made a bunch of money, I can certainly tell you that's not true. I wasn't there in 1975, 76 when this happened to his family, when I lived in the house, but I can tell you that he and the family hold to the truth behind it. Whatever people want to say about it is that, I can tell you that just from my own personal relationship with him and the other members of the family, that, for them, it was a very real experience. Regardless of, what, some people think it was a hoax because the movie portrayed things that couldn't have really happened, but that's a
yeah,
movie. I think people don't understand there's a difference between what really happened and what the movie should do. But in any event, became friends, and I think that there was a level of trust that developed. He was, because of so many things that had been written about him and said about him, he was pretty mistrustful, I think, in general of the media. Um, so, it was just becoming kind of personal friends, and then it just made natural sense that, here I'm live in Los Angeles. That's what I do for a living, and I make films, and and he kind of entrusted me with the rights that he held, and so I kind of ran with them for a little bit, and we made a deal that ended up, of all places, back at Dimension.
oh no.
Yeah, believe me, I wasn't thrilled. Um, I knew that was the death knell, but that's where it landed, and it wasn't through any effort of other people who had gotten involved. And so we kind of got double crossed, you know, a Dimension took the rights and then they ended up burying the project we wanted to make in favor of teaming up with MGM on their remake with Platinum Dunes. So, you know, we were kind of cut off at the knees there for a bit. And then after that happened, and then George Lutz unfortunately died shortly after that. But the family said, hey, you know, we don't really know this business. We don't really care so much about it. You know, the damage has really been done. So if you want to do something with it, it's fine. You know, and they've kind of been very generous with me in terms of keeping me involved. But yeah, so then the awakening came because I went and I met with Jason Blum, who had just done the Paranormal Activity films and was, you know, kind of become, it was before it was really Blumhouse that everybody knows now, but you know, he had a little office at the Paramount lot at the time, and I went in with this pitch with a partner, and I was like, wouldn't it be fun to like fool Jason Blum? So I gave him this whole like song and dance, this plot, you know, of the Amityville story, and convinced him it was all true. And then he goes, "Oh my God, like you have all this like material, da 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 da," and I was like, "Yeah, but we can make it up, you know." So, but I fooled him so much. He was like, was like that thing in when Tom Cruise was on Oprah and he started jumping on her sofa, and yeah, so it was right from there. We jumped off the into the pool and started to develop this idea, which ended up becoming The Awakening. Was not supposed to be that, and unfortunately, once again, Dimension got involved.
Yeah.
So I stayed sort of an arm's length away from all of it. I wasn't particularly a fan of the direction they took that, and you know, the movie was not successful. It also came out at a time when, you know, all the controversy and litigation and you know, criminal activities were being exposed within that company, rightfully. So you know, and the Weinstein castle came tumbling down. So that movie was just sort of casualty, I think, of all of those unfortunate circumstances. So you know, so it's out there. You know, people sort of like it. But then another opportunity came up, and to write, direct, and produce a movie, pretty low budget. You know, it was basically like, you know, a movie made for $700,000 to make a movie that would chronicle the murders that had occurred in that house before the Lutzes had taken occupancy of it.
I was actually going to ask about
the DeFeo murders. So,
DeFeo.
and so, you know, kind of combining the rights that the Lutzes held with the idea of the DeFeo massacre that had occurred so tragically in that house. You know, so I went off and this all happened very quickly in I think it was 17. And we made this movie called Amityville Murders, and it was a lot of fun to do. I got to direct it, write it, so it was kind of, in a weird way, like not the movie I'd intended to make originally, but it was kind of fun to be able to do one and create the house and kind of go back and revisit some of the pieces of the story. So yeah, that's where all that was kind of born. So
when writing that film,
yeah, go ahead.
When writing that film, did you draw upon the inspiration of the previous Amityville films? Where I forgot, I think it was maybe Amityville 2 when they did focus on DeFeo.
Well, I mean, that wasn't really DeFeo. They changed the
Oh.
name, and I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly I was influenced by it to the extent that I cast, you know, Diane Franklin, who was kind of an 80s icon actress who played the sister in Amityville 2, and now I made her the mother. We brought Burt Young back for a short cameo, again playing her father, but now the grandfather. So it was kind of winking, nodding to the family. I mean, that's the family, but the fans of Amityville 2 and the family that was depicted in Amityville 2. But it wasn't trying to be in any way connected to any of that stuff. It
Okay.
was its own thing. There'd never been a movie based on the DeFeo murders. And you know, ours certainly went into the realm of kind of the supernatural possibilities of it, but it wasn't intended to be a supernatural horror film like the Amityville Horror was. It was more of like, what if there was this at work in that house? What if he was, you know, so warped on drugs that he was envisioning these things, you know, and that he really, and the true story was that he really felt like his family was out to get him. At least that's what came out in the trial, and he felt like killing them was his way of getting them before they got him. That was part of his defense. So, I hinted at some of that in that movie, but through that lens of like a guy who's very disturbed, who's been abused by his father, who was kind of living on the edge, using a lot of heavy drugs, kind of a rebel in his own way, but also sort of a victim of a very abusive, controlling dad. But, again, I think the questions always come up about that house. It's like, well, was the house itself sort of an influence on what occurred there? So, I mean, there's mysteries about those murders that have never been solved. Like, why were they all on their stomachs? Why did nobody get up and run for their lives when the gunshots were heard? None of it makes sense. So, the movie was sort of about all of those things. It was fun to do. Wasn't a big budget movie, but it was an opportunity to kind of revisit the name and do it in a way that I thought was kind of cool.
Now, it's weird because have you actually thought about making like well, I won't say Never Sleep Again or Crystal Lake Memories thing about the Amityville, where it was like a full-on documentary thing about each of the film, especially because there are a lot of Amityville.
It's kind of a joke now. It's like Amityville Beach attack, like whatever they had, like the Amityville Shark Attack or something. I don't even know anymore. Here's like, people think those are Amityville movies. They're not. They're movies that people make with their iPhone in Scotland, and they use the word Amityville because it's just the name of a town. What they can't do is tell a story that takes place in that house. But luckily, because we have certain rights to the sequels and things, that we can tell that story. We can tell the story of the house, what happened after the family left the house. There's a lot of the Lutz story that hasn't been told. So, it would be great if we could get a project off the ground that told the aftermath of their experiences there.
Yeah. Especially with The Conjuring having and I wouldn't say like springing off the heels of The Conjuring, but definitely picking up the paces after The Conjuring, because I don't know if it's like I know the second movie actually deals with the
we have that opening scene in the house where Lorraine, and it's true, like the Warrens had gone into the house with the Lutz's blessing to investigate what might be there, what drove them out of that house after 28 days. So I think that first like hook scene, that opening scene of Conjuring 2 was Lorraine channeling the spirit of Ronald DeFeo and reliving the murders. So it was an interesting scene because they were cleverly trying to avoid the rights that the Lutzes have by involving the murders. So it was kind of a bit of a, I don't know, it was like a little bit of a legal maneuver the way they did it. But I mean, it's interesting, and I think, Conjuring owes a huge debt to the Amityville horror. And I mean, there's just always room and interesting and appetite, interest in these things, these titles from audiences. But all this other, I call it the Amityville bullshit movies that have nothing to do with anything. I mean, if it isn't set in that house, it's not an Amityville horror.
It is true, because or at the very least, if it isn't a piece of the house, then
but I mean, some reference to the people whose lives were affected by it. It's like, it's like, again, you can call a movie Halloween, but you can't make it about Michael Myers because you don't own that.
And again, speaking of horror, again, I would like to ask about the documentaries, both His Name Was Jason, Never Sleep Again, and Crystal Lake
Memories.
So now, we were just talking this before we started talking, and you said His Name Was Jason was more like it wasn't like the best one, because it was more like a compressed version of the story itself, story. But Crystal Lake Memories, that's an 8-hour documentary. That's like something you go watch.
Well, it's how it should have been done in the first place. Just the people who were involved in it didn't see it that way, and didn't want to support that vision of it. So I just went back later and fixed it. That's really what I did. Like a lot of the interviews came from His Name Was Jason. They're just the interviews that you never really got to see, because it was cut so short and so kind of like cut like a VH1 special, you know, as opposed to being like a real serious like documentary on the making of
Like
Friday the
a
13th. I had been involved in the book with Peter Bracke of Crystal Lake Memories. I had edited it and, you know, once I co-authored it, so it's his work completely. But I was really involved in the making of that book with Pete. And so when it came time to revisit it, we had done, his name was Jason after the book came out. And I just went to Peter at one point. I said, you know, would you mind if I use the name of the book as the title of this documentary? That'll be this really epic kind of way his book was, you know, this incredible like deep dive into everything that was Friday the 13th. So I just wanted to put that on screen, and luckily he was on board, and our other partner Jeff Garrett was on board, and we did it. And that was just right after the success we had with Never Sleep Again, which was, you know, at the time this unheard of 4-hour you know,
yeah.
documentary on the making of the Elm Street films, which was truly a
Now,
labor of love. We did it with no money, no backing, no permission from anybody. We just went and made it.
now, in terms of making a documentary, especially about both Halloween, I'm not Halloween, especially about Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, I would imagine getting essentially almost everyone from either cast or crew and stuff like that would be like legitimately hard
Mhm.
because as a producer, you're trying to find people who may be retired. You know, they could be like, I just don't want to do this. You know,
Mhm.
stuff like that too.
Well, we were fortunate with when we started with Never Sleep Again. My longtime friend and creative partner Tommy Hudson had a very long-standing personal relationship with Heather Langenkamp, who was
Oh,
Nancy.
awesome.
And because Heather was involved from the beginning, it helped get Wes Craven to do an interview. God bless him, and bringing Robert Englund in. And once you have those people, everybody else wants to jump on too. So
Yeah,
it wasn't easy. Some of the people were very hard to find. I could make a documentary about what it took to find, you know, Mark Patton from Part Two.
yeah,
It was insane. Just being able to find him was, he was unfindable
yeah.
at the
Mark
time, and it was
Patton.
very much, I think, by design. Now he's all over the place, which is fantastic. He made his own documentary about his experience, which
I
was
was just about
awesome.
to mention
Um,
if
yeah,
I,
so I just, you know, I was really the one that found Mark and brought him to our studio to film. We had T-shirts made, like we found him, and it was just joyful. Like the whole experience of making that was just joyful, even though none of us were getting paid, and we just did it as pure for the love of Freddy and all things Nightmare on Elm Street. So we just jumped in with like blindly hoping like, well, maybe other people like what we're doing, you know, and so, you know, Andrew Cash, who was the co-director and editor, and Buzz Wallach, who shot all of the interviews and all of the other pieces that we included, and Tommy, and it was just a very small group of us that just kind of threw caution to the wind, and we just went out and made it.
uh, now, like I was saying before, was like, were there people who were legitimately like you just mentioned Mark Penn and Mark
Yeah.
and his own documentary, he was talking about how he more or less uh, gotten away from the public eye. Were there
Mhm.
other actors who were hard to find because the way because with Nightmare on Elm Street, it's weird because there's a lot of famous actors who have come from Nightmare on Elm Street. You know, like Johnny Depp, Lawrence Fishburne, Patricia Arquette. You
Well,
know,
and you notice those are the ones we didn't get. So
yeah,
not for want of trying. We certainly tried. That being said, yeah, I mean, it's always hard to find people. It's, you know, a lot of these movies were at that time 20, 25 years old. So people move, you know, not everybody lives in Los Angeles. So, you know, and having very few resources, you know, we were able to mostly find everybody. It wasn't as much difficulty to find them as it was to wrangle a crew to get an interview film. So, and this is pre-Zoom calls and things like that.
yeah.
So it was really challenging. In fact, Ronnie Yu was like in Beijing, China, the director
Oh
of Freddy
wow,
versus Jason. So I happened to find like one independent camera guy that was in town, I think, for the Olympics and spoke English. And so he's like, "Yeah, I'll totally do it. I'm a Freddy fan, so let me go meet with him." And they met at some restaurant in Beijing, I think, and that's how we got Ronnie Yu. And I was on, you know, the equivalent of like a Skype call. I guess it was Skype, but very primitive.
Yeah.
But those were the ways, there were people who lived in the rural parts of Texas that we had to figure out how we're going to get them on camera. There were people in Canada, there were people everywhere. So yeah, I think it was just wrangling a way to get everybody on camera when you don't really have a budget. But we figured it out.
Now, between both documentaries and well, those three documentaries plus with these three documentaries,
Yeah.
how did you do Freddy vs. Jason and not make it like the same information just told more than once? Because his name was Jason. I mean,
No, I know what you're saying. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
We specifically talked about that, where we weren't going to repeat ourselves between the two shows. We actually made one of the segments, the one for Crystal Lake Memories, was all focused on Jason, and the one on from Never Sleep Again, we focused all the discussion on Freddy. So that's how we differentiated them. But so there's really no, I mean, some of the interviewers are the same, or interviewees are the same, but we really made a conscious effort to not repeat the same information.
Now, you did mention Zoom and Skype calls and like that, especially nowadays where a lot more is done over the computer like this.
Mm-hmm.
Could you see yourself trying to do a documentary over the computer, like
Maybe.
say,
Yeah,
like
maybe.
for a documentary?
I mean, who knows? I mean, there's such a different world we live in since the pandemic that I think it wouldn't be put off necessarily by something that looked like it was taken on a Zoom call. I mean, obviously, you want some production value. We worked really hard on those shows to make them look good. We didn't just put people in front of a bookcase or something. We created like original backgrounds and green screen plates, and we really worked hard to make them look as good as we could for the resources that we had. And
Yeah.
people that were local all came to a sound stage that we were able to rent very cheaply, and put them in front of a green screen, and then went out and shot a bunch of like really cool like Elm Street style plates so that it looked like they were in Freddy's boiler room or whatever.
Yeah.
So, but all that stuff, it just takes a lot of time and a lot of work. And talked about films versus documentaries. I actually find making documentaries a lot more difficult than making a traditional film.
A lot more what?
A lot more difficult.
Oh yeah, it's. I had my screenwriting class a few years ago. One of my classmates was actually getting her a degree in documentary. I think it was like an honorary degree that my college had. That
Okay.
it was more like a certificate thing for it. So if you were like it was a certificate in documentary.
Okay.
And she said that her documentary that she was doing was about her friend who I believe was battling cancer, but she was living in San Francisco. So she had to go and make time to leave New York City to go to San Francisco and speak to her for a few days and get as much footage as she could with her, and then go back to New York to film to essentially add whatever footage she had with the footage she has. So yeah, I definitely do think that making a documentary is probably a lot more harder than a film, because not only like the same thing with hosting and producing a podcast, where it's just basically would I be free at the same time as my guests, or would my guests be free at the same time? As it's all about scheduling and editing and stuff like that too. And especially with documentaries, you also have to employ a narrator. Is like, how much would the narrator have to read off from a script? So it's like, even though you would think maybe a documentary would be a lot more easier to do, it's a lot more harder when you probably probably think about it, because there are great documentaries out there, and if you ask any other documentary director about it, they're probably like, that was like 5 years of my life. And I imagine, something like Crystal Lake Memories or Never Sleep Again was probably like a year or maybe even months of your life. and it would.
Yeah, I know. It's like an endless process, and when you're dealing with interviews of upwards of 100 people on these shows, and running times of multiple hours, it's it's just a recipe for driving yourself insane and trying to make some narrative thread so that it all works. You know, it doesn't all just fit together like a puzzle. It's like having to fit it and make it breathe and make it feel organic and make it like you're still telling a story. And you know, there's no scripted dialogue like in a feature. When you're cutting a feature, it's like, okay, they said these lines, and here's how we're going to cut that together. You don't know what you're going to get until you've gotten it, the documentary.
Yeah.
So it's just trying to find that narrative through line to keep the story moving forward without repeating yourself endlessly or going back and making you know, points that maybe aren't as interesting as others, and just editorializing the whole way. So yeah, I mean, it's all, documentaries are, they're certainly, you know, the production side is challenging because the number, especially the ones we did where there's so many people involved, but just trying to keep track of all of that and tell the story in a linear but entertaining way is definitely not easy. Not easy. A lot of people think they can do it. It's really not easy.
Yeah, especially if it's a big series like a Friday the 13th, a Halloween, or Nightmare on Elm Street,
Right.
where
Yeah, where you've got like multiple sequels and years to track with, you know.
like I imagine if someone decided to do a documentary about the Universal monsters, you would have to go all the way at the beginning and then stop at the last monster movies and then talk about the remakes that had this that came
Right.
out,
Yeah, you have to kind of decide what
like
your
focuses. And
focuses, and yeah, and that would be challenging because nobody's alive. So
yeah,
but yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the things, and the fact that we did get these things done before, you know, the great Wes Craven passed. And you know, it's like, talk about time capsules. I mean, I hope that those shows as years go on become kind of time capsules of what they were, you know, what these films were about and who made them and how they got created. So I mean, for me, that was just really fun and really an honor to be able to document that.
to cut it short, I do have like three quick questions. One, social media. Do you have any social media that you do want to plug, like
I,
Instagram, Twitter?
yeah, I'm pretty findable. There's nothing I want to plug. I mean, you can just look me up on social media. I'm friends with a lot of, you know, horror fans, Halloween 6 fans, especially. I'm very easy to find on Facebook and Instagram.
You just mentioned two projects. Do you want to talk about those two projects? Not like two quick things about those two projects coming up. Or
Yeah. I'm excited. Yeah, the first one is coming out. Both are going to be released theatrically by Fathom, which does kind of like these limited theatrical special event runs of films. And so, yeah, starting the first one, I believe, is August 15th, or thereabouts. Fathom will have my first film, pandemic movie, I call it. It's not about the pandemic, but
it was filmed during.
it's a really filmed during the pandemic. In fact, it was the first independent movie to be greenlit during the pandemic, so it was quite a challenge to be able to pull that off. But that being said, it's called Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman,
Hmm.
starring Chad Michael Murray, playing the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. I think doing a really great job of portraying him to be the monstrous serial killer, destroyer of lives that he was, and not making him, you know, for lack of a better word, a kind of like a cultural hero. I think that's exactly the opposite of the movie that I set out to make, and he tried to make one that was, you know, true to the essence of the story. Not a documentary, so you know, certainly some creative license was taken here and there, but it was really to kind of show Bundy and killers like him that they were not worthy of being put on a t-shirt. You
Yeah.
know, I feel like there's this strange subculture out there that worships these sadistic monsters, and it troubles me. It's not like having a Michael Myers t-shirt, because we all know that he is fictional. But when people run around with Charles Manson t-shirts and,
It's just
you know,
weird.
Ted Bundy t-shirts and glorify these people, it troubles me on a very primal level. And so this movie, and then a movie I made a couple years ago that got me in a lot of hot water called The Haunting of Sharon Tate, um, uh, is my reaction to this kind of glorifying of murderers, which I find horrific.
Hmm. And my last question is fairly easy. Do you have any advice to those who are screenwriters, filmmakers, producing, acting, what have you, especially in the performing arts, especially in filmmaking?
Hmm. Oh gosh. Follow, it's so much advice, but follow your passion and tell stories that are meaningful to you. Don't give up, because it's the last man standing a lot of times. But also recognize your abilities. Some people aren't cut out for it, and there's nothing wrong with that. There are other things to do in life than make films if it's not really what your calling is, or what your passion is, or what you're kind of good at.
Yeah.
But I think that I would always say, just tell stories that are meaningful and are heartfelt. And whether that means to scare people or to make people cry or make them laugh, kind of go for it and tell it only the way that you can tell it.
And on that note, thank you, Daniel, for being a great guest on today's podcast. I know we ran a lot late. I don't mind it, but sometimes sometimes when the direction, I mean, not sometimes when the conversation goes longer than expected, we get a lot of great coverage out of topics. And yeah,
Yeah,
you had
it's
a
fun.
great time being a great guest. I mean, a guest on the show. I hope you all enjoyed listening to us talk about films, how horror wise, documentary stuff, or just filmmaking in general. So yeah, take care, everyone. Please be safe and be well.
You too. Thanks again for having me.
Of course.